without further ado, let's get into this. Please welcome, with a little applause like this, the amazing Reverend Liz Edmond.
I'm so delighted to be here with you this evening. I want to just start off by acknowledging that I'm sitting on the island of Manhattan in New York, which is the unceded ancestral land of the Munsee Lenape people. Pam, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. King Jules, thank you for being here and for your wonderful words. And all of you who are gathered. Pam tells me that a big part of National Affirming Day this year, the Pi Day, is to identify next steps in what it means to be affirming, you know? And that's such a beautiful question to be asking, because we've reached a point where, you know, for a lot of people, you know, it's wonderful to be nice and it's wonderful to be inclusive and it's wonderful to be tolerant, but there's a next waiting to happen. And so the fact that y'all are taking that on, that's fantastic, and I honor that. And that's what our conversation is going to be about tonight, is helping to think about what would that look like? What are some really good next steps that we can all be taking? So to get us started, I'm going to give you this talk that I give that's like sort of like Queer Virtue 101. Pam and I thought that it might be helpful just kind of lay out sort of like the basic ideas in terms of what I think of in terms of queerness and faith, specifically queerness and Christianity. This is very similar to a talk that I gave last year. And so it's quite possible that some of you have heard it before. So if you have, forgive us, just going to stay with it. But this is the easiest way to kind of lay out the basics of the book without me going on and on and on, and give you a sense of the theology and ethics that undergird my work. So we've got three parts. Pam just kind of spelled this out a little bit. First, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I mean by the queerness of the Christian tradition. Then Pam and I are going to dialogue a little bit about next steps. And then I'm going to talk more about why I think this conversation matters so much right now, and why your commitment to taking next steps matters so much right now. So with that, let's dive in. Here we go. One of the queerest stories I know begins not in a fabulous city, not on a glittering dance floor. It begins in a nameless backwater town. Actually, this story starts in a barn. A young woman is traveling with her husband-to-be. She is very pregnant, and were it not for the generosity of her fiance, who is not this child's father, she would face a perilous future as an unwed mother. A lot of people are on this same road, and the inn where they try to get a room is booked up, or so the innkeeper says. Maybe he just takes one look at this woman, knows she's about to go into labor, and he doesn't want to deal with the fleshy, wet mess that her body's about to churn out. Maybe he doesn't want to hear her groans, her cries of pain. But the guy has a heart. Look, you can stay the night in the barn out back. She gives birth that night in a stall, surrounded by donkeys and sheep, and her afterbirth will land in hay, easily swept up in the morning along with whatever the animals have not so delicately excreted in the middle of the night. You know this story. We all know this story. This is how the Christian narrative begins. Christians proudly proclaim that this baby, this bloody, illegitimate bundle of quivering flesh, is God incarnate. It never ceases to amaze me that this tradition will warp into a movement famous for demonizing bodies and their desires. We Christians openly preach that the power of God infused a human form while violating the most basic sexual conventions of the day. The essential premise of the faith is that somewhere in this extraordinary mix of flesh and spirit and scandal lurks the promise of ultimate spiritual health for the human race. I priest. What draws me into this faith tradition is precisely this story, this God, who doesn't hesitate to enter into a body just like mine, just like yours, disrupting everything we might tend to believe about how bodies and souls relate to each other. What draws me into this faith tradition is precisely the fact that I am queer, that I have lived my life among people who understand that yes, we are carnal beings, and yes, we are called to make transcendent beauty visible to the world. So I have to tell you, it bewilders me whenever somebody cites religious belief to justify treating LGBTQ people like crap. Seriously, I find it viscerally confusing. But even more than that, it breaks my heart. Queerphobic religion is the biggest drag on our movement toward justice, and wow, does it take a toll on queer souls. Let me tell you another story. And this is a story you probably know firsthand. A young person, probably a teenager, goes looking for spiritual community. This person finds an evangelical Christian group and joins it, feeling a sense of welcome and of home that rivals anything they have ever experienced. Then this person comes out as queer and finds themselves being spiritually disemboweled by the same community that once promised unconditional love. This is a painfully common narrative in queer life stories. The spiritual bait and switch is not just sad, it does immense damage. In one fell swoop, it erodes a young person's ability to trust themselves, their community, and God. In some queer people, it breeds despair that is literally suicidal. And there's not a question in my mind that the theology behind this bait and switch is rooted in blasphemy. In recent decades, many progressive denominations have made strides towards celebrating the lives and ministries of two-spirit LGBTQ people. The fact that we are all here this evening is both a hopeful sign and a symbol of that movement. That said, those of us on the religious left have not done nearly enough to explain to the world why, theologically, we know we're on the right path. This creates the appearance of theological dissonance. Over the years, it has led to way too many kind-hearted, well-intentioned Pride Sunday sermons that are tepid and weak and, worst of all, boring. I tell you, the church would not be in decline if over the past 40 years we had more consistently preached a gospel that is exciting, robust, and that speaks truthfully to people's real lives. My work is an attempt to address all of this. I am convinced that a theology that is good for the queers will also be good for the church. I'm in New York. I don't know if you can hear this. I've got like sirens and stuff going on, so please forgive all the background noise. I'm just going to plow ahead. I refer to this theology as queer virtue, and it has two basic premises. One, that queer people possess virtue according to terms that Christianity itself sets. Two, that Christian communities could learn a lot from queer people about how to live our faith, how to be the church more effectively and with greater consequence. Queer virtue draws on the academic discipline of queer theory. In queer theory, the word queer becomes a verb. To queer is to rupture false binaries. Or, put another way, queer theory works to disrupt Black and white thinking, particularly two-spirit LGBTQ people constantly rupture or queer the idea that male and female are two distinct categories. Queer people may be androgynous in our dress. Our marriages often do not include one man and one woman. Intersex people tell us plainly, there's no such thing as a simple biological binary. And growing numbers of trans and gender expansive folks reject any neat conception of themselves as male or female at all. By rupturing the false binary of male and female, queer theory establishes a conceptual space for LGBTQ people to inhabit. This queer approach to binaries has helped me to think in a new way about Christian faith. What I see in Christianity is a relentless disruption of false binaries. For example, was Jesus human or was he divine? Well, we Christians say he was both. After the resurrection, was Jesus alive or had he died? We say both. And when Jesus touched people who were ritually unclean in order to heal them, were his actions sacred or were they profane? Well, both. Jesus was a master storyteller. One of his most famous parables is the story of the Good Samaritan. A lawyer asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus responds by asking the lawyer to imagine that he's traveling down a road and is robbed and beaten nearly to death. Two of his colleagues see him and cross the road to avoid having to deal with his crisis. A third man comes by, a man that the lawyer would have identified as his inferior and worse, as a moral degenerate. You know the story. It's the third man, the degenerate, who helps him. So Jesus turns the question back to the lawyer. You tell me who your neighbor is. Jesus challenges this lawyer to disrupt his understanding of who he is, who the Samaritan is, and how God demands that they relate to each other. One of the biggest binaries that Jesus challenges his followers to rupture is the one between self and other. Jesus repeatedly demands that we upend simplistic notions of who I am in relation to you, or to that person over there who is despised, or the wrong sex, or sick, or ritually unclean. Jesus got this movement going, but it was Paul who worked his butt off to create communities that would follow Jesus. Paul was the chief architect of the theology and ethical path that would guide these churches. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul continues this business of disrupting the binary of self and other. He writes, "There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus." These were the biggest binaries in Paul's day, and he ruptured every one of them. These rupturings, these queerings, are not peripheral to Christianity. Both theologically and ethically, they are at the very heart of the Christian movement, which is why I argue that authentic Christianity is and must be queer. It's clear to me that the church could learn a lot about its mission and purpose by looking to queer experience. To understand what I mean by this, let's take a moment to consider what queer life entails. Queer experience often, not always, but very often, looks something like this. And just so you know, this is exactly the part where Pam and I are going to be talking about later on. It's like this path, and this is exactly what we're going to be talking about. So here's the part, here's the stuff to pay attention to. Okay, coming back. Queer experience often, not always, but very often looks something like this. You have to discern an identity that affects how you perceive yourself in the world, how you relate to other people, and how you'll navigate your most intimate relationships. You have to get honest with yourself about that identity and tell the truth about it to others, even when doing so puts you at risk. You have to touch others, by which I mean you have to connect with other people who have discerned a similar identity. This is a touch that can be physical or spiritual or both. You have to build community with those people, creating what is essentially an adopted family. Then, queer people have a strong record of looking to the margins to see who is still struggling and doing something about that. This is the path of queer virtue. It's important to note that these steps are not in a fixed order, not once and done. These demands interact with each other, exacting more precise demands all the time. A queer person lives them over and over again. I call this a path of virtue because in the Aristotelian sense, it's something that you get better at the more you have to do it. But none of us walks it perfectly. And some queer folk flat out refuse to walk parts of it at all. Still, again and again, it impresses me how dedicated my community is overall to this path and how hard we work to stay on it and to make it accessible to others. As a priest, what I have long observed is that this path bears a freakish resemblance to the ethical path that Christians are supposed to follow. Christians also have to discern an identity for us. This is an identity as people created by God who depend on God for our very being. We're supposed to tell others about that identity. That's what evangelism should be. We're supposed to engage with others, build community together, look to the margins to see who's struggling and do something about that. It's no accident that these two paths, queer and Christian, are so resonant. Once you understand the extent to which Christianity is about disrupting false binaries, about queering, it makes perfect sense that queer and authentic Christian ethics are so similar. What is perhaps noteworthy is that what this priest knows about Christian virtue, about Christianity as an ethical path, I have learned primarily from walking this queer path every day of my life.
Thank you, Liz. I know that it is extremely hard to sort of distill such a huge, idea into 10 minutes. And yet you did somehow. And what I'm really excited about is those 5 things. And like you said, it's not necessarily in that order, or we jump around organically in life and all of those things, but to sort of have a little excavation of each one, I think is really interesting to help enflesh a really big idea into something that is accessible for us. And I think the really exciting thing to me is, similarly to PIE, public, intentional, and explicit, I think that these steps also invite us to know, okay, who are we right now? Because if we don't have sort of that sense of identity, if we don't know that, how can we go in a truthful direction forward if we're not really sure what that is? How can we do that in community? And then how do we do that in a way that others might call scandal, but that is, hospitality, that's radical hospitality, and make change in the world. So I'm curious about step 1. When I think about identity and pride, because this one might be, literally the first thing that we think about when we think about queerness, right? Like, how do you identify, right? We ask that question to each other, or we say, I self-identify as blank. And so what are some key points around identity and pride around this path?
So let me say first that when you asked me about sort of thinking about next steps, one of the ways that I think we can move beyond sort of just simple tolerance and inclusion and those kinds of ideas is to sort of flip the lens so that, it's so tempting, I think, for faith communities to think of queer people as, oh, those folks we need to be nice to, those folks we need to minister to, and they're automatically kind of gets us and them thing going there. And that's one of the real challenges, I think, in taking next steps, is figuring out how to disrupt queer, that whole us and them thing. And what I want to suggest as we talk about next steps kind of in an overarching way for all the next steps we're going to suggest, what I want to suggest is that we try to use queerness as a model for thinking about other kinds of ethical decisions, so that queer experience becomes not just okay, but actually authoritative. And I don't mean here that queer experience trumps any other kind of human knowledge. I don't mean that. What I mean is our experience, all of us, gives us expertise in different kinds of matters. And how much that somebody respects you if they respect the expertise you bring.
Right.
So what I'm asking here for you all to think about is, what would it look like to make queer experience authoritative in some way in your own ethical deliberation? So given that, sorry, I just wanted to kind of set that framework.
That's great.
Here.
Yeah.
Okay. So Pam, as you said, like this sort of the first step on the path is identity, and that's closely linked to the idea of pride for queer people. So as we talk about identity, I want you all not necessarily just to be thinking about queer identity, but your own identity. Identities, plural. We all have like multiple identity markers, right? So as you're thinking about what identity is for you and what identities exist within you, here's sort of how I conceptualize identity. One, of course, is that it's this immensely powerful thing functioning inside each one of us, because identity involves your own deepest knowledge of who you are. And it becomes kind of the basis for decisions that you make about who you intend to be and how you live into your life. Identity is also often the root of the question or the statement, I know X, or I believe X because of who I am.
Right.
And this is absolutely fundamental to Christianity. That's the basic message I think that Jesus was trying to communicate. Orient yourself to the sacred completely, because that's who you are. That's who God made you to be. So as you're thinking about identity, this isn't necessarily just a characteristic, it's something deep, and it might have to do with where you're from or where your people were from or the faith that you carry around. There are lots of things it can have to do with, but at that really deep level, the idea is that identity is so much a part of who you are that, it's the kind of thing that people need to know it about you in order to understand you. Like when you use some little catchphrase and nobody quite knows what that means, it may be an identity marker. Oh, my people always say X, an identity colors how you express yourself. It might affect who you hang out with or who you don't hang out with, what you do together, and how you treat each other. At its best, I think, an identity is something that makes you feel proud of yourself in a good way. And sometimes, if you take your identity seriously, it might make you aware that you haven't necessarily lived up to what your identity demands. Sometimes I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is by being falsely proud. I'm going to use lowercase p, like proud, like sort of haughty about an identity, when in fact, maybe in that moment, you shouldn't feel so good about yourself here. So that's the power of identity.
I love how you put that in terms of feeling like wondering if we're living up to the thing that we, have identified as. And I think when we think about sort of what next steps could we take when it comes to our spiritual practice, one of the things that I think of is, the gift of being queer or having to navigate a world that isn't necessarily made for you in many ways, is you do have to do the work of figuring out who you are. And that's actually something that I never did before I came out. I was a Christian for a long, long time, but I didn't actually really think about what is my identity as a Christian? What does that mean? How does that feed others? All of those things that I had to think about until afterwards. And I had to really think, what does this mean for me? And so, you talk about that it's, what could this look like? That we could name something that's an identity marker for us or our community. We are known for XYZ, or we're known for this right now, but we want to evolve to a place where it's something more over here. um, Asking ourselves, what does this identity demand from you? And is there anything queer about it? And by that, like you said, Liz, what disrupts binaries? What sort of troubles the waters in a good way? One of my friends said, that sometimes queer folks walk through the world terrorizing this idea of only two genders, right? And I like that idea of, troubling things in a good way that creates an expansiveness, right? And then also asking us, are we proud of this, and how and why? And being able to sort of name those things as people of faith, which I think is really beautiful. Did you want to say anything else about that before we go to the next
I just
section?
wanted to tag on to the very last thing that you just said, that is exactly the challenge here that we're issuing with this next step, is to think about your identity as a person of faith.
Right.
What does it mean to you, really? At what level is your faith deeply, deeply a part of who you are, so that it affects things like how you speak, how you treat people, who you hang out with, what you value, the person that you intend to be? Pam, just as you said, particularly for those of us in places of privilege, it can be really easy not really to think about who we are. It's really easy just to kind of take that for granted. But so this is about sort of like being aware of that, and then digging into the question,
Right.
who am I?
Yeah. And have we thought about whether people have put us into a box that means something? Is that true for us? And if not, how can we embody something that is different and that is true for us? So next we have risk and coming out. And those things usually, even in, the most friendly situations, coming out is a risk. There is inherent risk involved in such a vulnerable thing that often it's not just a one-time thing. It's out and out and out and out, right? So what are some key points around how we would explore that virtue in our spiritual path?
Yeah. So, the sort of basic premise here is that once you know who you are, it matters to tell the truth about that. I love pie. I just love it so much, because it matters to tell the truth about who you are in ways that are public, intentional, and explicit. It's just such a great framing for this concept. People say to me a lot, it wasn't that hard for me to come out as queer. Well, wow, it's like coming out as Christian is like really tough,
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's good to start with the identity piece. What does that mean to you? And how can you live into that visibly? That's what the sort of the coming out piece is. And it matters to say that telling the truth about who you are can involve risk. I think for folks who are shy about coming out as Christian, it matters really to get honest about how much risk are we really talking about here. Because the truth is that some people face far more risk than others just being who they are out in the world, and queer people are among those who take tremendous risk, just walking the streets, being who we are. My essential premise here is that kind of risk, I like to say that risk in this sense is the verb form of faith. What I mean by that is, if you know that your identity, who you are, is rooted in God, rooted in transcendent truth, if you know there is truth in it, then you're called to trust that who you are is part of something that's bigger than you. And you may face risks, but that bigger thing that you're part of, it won't die, no matter how much violence is directed at you. Part of what queer people model, and we see this right now, especially among trans women of color, who are the subject of just terrible assault still on a daily basis. You know, you gotta believe I am part of something bigger than I am, and that's gonna live on even if I am killed.
Mm-hmm.
That's, to me, that is the verb form of faith.
And I think, you know, Liz, like you were saying, I think that that is an incredible challenge and invitation. I think, as you know, whatever our word is for ourselves or our communities, what we strive for, being affirming, inclusive. And, you know, sometimes we might feel that our next step is risky. You know, we're in a city where putting up a rainbow flag is going to be risky. We're in a city where even being a progressive person or faith community gets you kind of bullied, right? You know, and we feel these constraints. And I think it also is, it's fair to say, can you risk more so that queer people don't have to risk as much? And what kind of risk might you take? And being aware of the very real situations that folks are in, and being able to, as a community, whether it's your family or your church, whatever that looks like, is to say, in what ways can we risk more? And can we come out to say, this is who we are, this is what we believe in, this is what love looks like for us, even when you're uncertain of the outcome, because like you said, you know it's true. And you know, how in comparing, how can we risk in ways that will make others more comfortable and less at risk? And I think that that is an invitation. I think that it's really easy to say that, but it's really hard when it means that we have to experience discomfort in ways that we haven't before. And I think that, you know, that for me is, and I also, you know, think at the moment, I think about queer folks who are Christians or are, you know, have some sort of faith tradition that's important to them. They can face risk in all the different intersections, right? To be a person of faith and queer, and among people who might see you as, you know, that your faith betrays your queerness because it's so harmful for so many people. And so how can we sort of take the lessons from still being able to risk and come out from virtues that of the queer path, and use that same, you know, thing to challenge us? I don't know what exemplifies sort of the life of Jesus than a life of risk and coming out, right?
I want to just tag on again that you know, we're living. If we were having this conversation 5, 6, 7 years ago, we might really primarily be talking about things like social embarrassment. I don't want people to think I'm Christian. I don't, you know, I don't like that. I don't like the way that sounds, you know. But I mean, you know, your government right now is trying to get a convoy of trucks away from the Capitol. And in a movement that now is being driven by Christian nationalism. And again, of course, that's, you know, I was so stunned to see that going on in Canada, because I'm so used to thinking about that as being this American phenomenon, you know, where Christian nationalism now becomes part of this far right-wing movement, which very often is targeting queer people, Black people, Indigenous people. You know, it's anti-Semitic, it's Islamophobic. It's, you know, there are so many people who are on the front lines being targeted by this movement, but it's real and it's visible and it is increasingly kind of in our faces, all of us. And this is a moment. It's a really important moment where those of us who live a different kind of Christianity need to be visible in that, because the risks are big, and we don't know how bad that's going to get. We don't know how violent that's going to get.
Right. And like you said, I think, I mean, all the complications of sort of that label aside, and definitely with respect for people, however they want to identify their faith. I know for me, I didn't really use the word Christian for a long time because it does have a sting to it, right? Which is completely understandable. And then when we look at quote unquote freedom movements that are anything but, we also have this is an invitation, I think, in some ways, for some of us, to say, actually, that's not what my identity stands for. This is what it means for me, right? I just read an article by Reverend Michael Koren, right? Who says, like, this kind of Christianity is unrecognizable to me. This is fundamentalism. This is not the life of Jesus that said, give to others. Even if they ask for your shirt, give them your coat too. Like, this is not sort of, the politics that Jesus had. And so being able to sort of claim the identities and speak back into it, and also say that part doesn't define me, right? We get excited. So, and I know this is why, we hope that you can dive into more of Queer Virtue and Liz's work more after, because we're just sort of touching in on these pieces as a taste. So the next step that we're coming to, Liz, is one that is not talked about hardly at all in many communities, which is touch. And, share a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah. So I mentioned when I was talking earlier, that on the queer path, touch is this place where a queer person begins to explore their identity by finding other people who share that identity and touching them, and sometimes that is physical, sometimes it's sexual, sometimes it's spiritual, but you gotta find other people who share whatever that identity marker is in order to understand what it is, what it means for you, like how you're going to live into, how other people live into it, how you're going to live into it, and also what it demands of you, because identities demand things of you. They ask you to square your shoulders sometimes and do things that might be hard, and you do it because this is who I am. So touch is one of the ways that a person learns about the identities that we carry around. One of the things that's interesting about queer identity is that very often it's not an identity that is shared by members of your family of origin. Sometimes it is, but for a lot of queer people, like we kind of grow up in, like, we find ourselves and then we have to go looking for other people who share this identity because our parents or whoever raised us aren't necessarily equipped to teach us much about it. So you connect with other people. That's exactly what that touch is. Now, this is where it gets interesting here. Okay, Scripture uses touch as a metaphor for communion with God over and over again. These metaphors are often explicitly sexual. All that bride and bridegroom, that bride chamber, all that stuff is explicitly sexual metaphor at work that has to do with the relationship between the church and God, humanity and God, individual communion with God, all this sexual stuff. And in the same way that sexual connection can be profoundly moving and rewarding and meaningful, it can also be risky and dangerous and hurtful. And in the same way, touching God is like that too. Sometimes it's like, oh my God, the most mind-blowing thing you've ever experienced in your life. And sometimes it's really dangerous. and you get really wounded by it. There's this Hebrew word, nagah, which means touch. And it's interesting that the touch of God almost always wounds you and heals you at the same time. Think about the Isaiah with the coal, when it's holy, 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 the sanctuaries, holy, holy, holy Lord God of heaven. He's in this temple, and this angel flies up with this coal to sear his lips. How? So that he can proclaim the word.
Yeah.
You know, wounds and heals at the same time. One of the things that queer people model is that we embody. We embrace our embodied state. We understand the need to touch others. We celebrate it, we talk about it physically, sexually, and spiritually. And we know a lot about the paradox of the blessing and the danger of love.
Right. Right. And that is a complex and I think very nuanced balance in there of and how do we have that conversation in church, right? How do we have that conversation in church where people, you know, I know growing up for me, it was like, oh yeah, Song of Solomon is kind of there somewhere, you know, it's a metaphor for, you know, what grown-ups do when after they get married, right? And there's sort of, you know, this kind of shame and embarrassment around it. And then when we think about how that sort of, you know, even in more progressive churches, I think dilute it often, right? Because we still sort of have this idea that anything that is queer, which I would consider under this, is sort of risque. It has this inherent, like, I don't know if we can talk about it. And so I think when we sort of set aside our preconceived notions, or like, oh, I can't have this conversation at the same time as I have a spiritual conversation, then I think we're missing out on something really rich. And if we feel too fearful of, you know, the complexity of what this means. And so, Liz, I wonder, you know, when I think about what does this look like? And, you know, does it look like having a discussion with members of our community, you know, about the relationship between these different kinds of touches and how this helps us sort of, you know, understand ourselves and our faith. And, you know, and asking, I think like you said, like, what a powerful question to ask ourselves, like, what is our experience of, I can't remember how to pronounce it, Naga.
Hard G, Naga.
Yeah. The touch of love that wounds and heals. Yeah, this is a compelling invitation for sure, right? On this path that takes, what does it take? Risk, right? Which we already talked about. One of the things that I find really fascinating, and what I deeply love about so many queer folks that I know, is their ability to form communities that are essentially adopted families. And you talk about that in sort of the adoption and authenticity step. And so I'm curious for you to share more with us about what that means.
Yeah, you know, that this is something that's really, it's crystal clear that this is a step on the path that is shared by queer people and Christians. You know, the idea behind Christian community was never supposed to be that this is something we just inherit, you know, we grow up in it, it's ours. Like, from the earliest time, entering into Christian community was a risky thing to do, but it was also complicated because it was a long time before early Christians thought of themselves as Christians. This was a Jewish sect for a long time. And of course, the people of Israel are a people, a nation, you know, like an ethnic, you know, group, right? So Paul's out spreading the word to all these Gentiles. And the question becomes, how can these people claim kinship to the God of Israel? And what Paul talks about is this idea: you are adopted by God, That's his, to help people to kind of conceive what that is, and then to begin thinking about ourselves as siblings of each other, because we are an adopted family, and that means we're an intentional family. We choose to be in connection with each other. Because we choose to be in connection with each other, that sets a high bar for honesty and accountability inside of our communities. And this is something, I'm just going to say it, I haven't known a great many churches that take that seriously as part of our call in Christian community. The idea that we are supposed to pay attention to power dynamics, and we are supposed to be truthful about the stuff that's actually going on and the things we actually care about when we're in conflict with one another, so that we're not just kind of like passing the buck, oh, that's what God wants, no, why do you want that? Why do you care about it? What are you afraid of, really? And can we have those conversations and hold them with compassion? And especially when there's conflict, to me, that is one of the highest callings of Christian community. It should be where we come together as adopted family to work out this business of self and other, figuring that out. We should practice. Churches should be places where we practice that.
Right.
And that's why thinking of ourselves as adopted family, I think can help. We need to treat each other like good family members.
Good family members. That's the key. Some of us are like, okay, don't treat me like family. But I think that is, I think this step in particular was really compelling to me because, this whole idea of, I just see so often in so many different communities across Canada when they feel so sort of stuck and fearful of starting to have these harder conversations around being affirming, right? And something I always invite them to do is, this is actually really exciting because you can find out who you are. You might think you know who you are, and you actually might discover that you're pretty right on. You might be pleasantly surprised. You might be shocked. But you can't go anywhere unless the authenticity is there. And I think that's what, gets me excited about the evolution of us even moving beyond affirming and into queer virtue is this idea that we can use that authenticity for anything. Just like in a relationship, we have to know where we're at in order to know where we're going. And so I think it's too easy to sort of not engage in our community, not have these intentional and honest conversations about who we are. Why is this important to us? Why is this conflict happening? Have we just sort of let these different things that are draining our ability to be expansive, continue on, and to be a good, as much as possible, functional family where while we're doing this, we can still say to those that are there, you belong. We are figuring this out together. And that correlation I think is tough for a lot of us because family is complicated, but it is, again, like we're in communities for a reason. We've chosen that. And so how are we contributing as the member, right? And like you said, it's called practicing our faith, right? So it has to be active and it has to be something that we're committed to being better at.
You're absolutely right about that. And I like the way you were talking about how this in practicing being authentic and honest. That can be a conversation that has to do with, are we affirming or not? What steps are we taking? It absolutely can be about that, but it doesn't need to be about that. That this business about being authentic, about what's really going on for you in church is crucial no matter what you're talking about. And let me just say that not being authentic, not having open conversation about what's really going on in any kind of church conversation is one of the most insidious ways that people who are not queer make it profoundly unsafe for people who are queer. So if you want to, like if you're serious about taking next steps, this is absolutely crucial. And queer people in your midst, we know a lot about telling hard truths. Yeah. We know a lot about trying to do that with compassion, trying to do that in a way that actually maintains relationship. Not all of us are good at it, and you know that. Some of us are really good at it, and some of us are really not. You know that. But there are queer people who are really good at it. Yeah. So I just want to commend this for your consideration as a really crucial next step in terms of making our communities not just welcoming and tolerant and all that, but actually safe, in an appropriate way.
Right.
For queer people.
And I think that that's something really hard to hear in some ways, but also really key because, even anecdotally, the amount of times that I'm sure you and I and many others who work among, faith communities know people who have been deeply hurt because they had an understanding about a faith community being able to be in that family. And yet that community wasn't actually authentic about who they were. And so they end up getting hurt, right? And you see, it's not just about the rainbow flag, right? It's that isn't only the kind of work that we have to do. And I would much rather, and I tell churches this, I would much rather a church say, listen, we're on our way, but we are not there yet. I'm not exactly sure how you might be welcomed into our community. I don't know yet, right? And I would rather that authenticity happen and be honest as harm reduction, but also hopefully in a way that we say we are working on this transformation so that way we can be confident that who we say we are is who we are.
This is so important, because when I think about the stories that I have heard about queer people being burned in progressive Christian communities, right. Christian communities that say they're so affirming, almost every story I can think of, a person was taken out, really badly burned, not by somebody saying, I don't want you to get married, or I don't want you to do this. It's something else. It's something else altogether that comes up from around the back and slams them in the back of the head like a 2x4, and they never saw it coming. Right. And the people who are doing that will absolutely insist, it's not about you being queer. It's not about that. It's not about you being trans. It's not about you being Black. It's not about, no. It's this thing you did that really offended me, or that broke right. this rule, or whatever. And if we were more honest with each other across the board, that queer people could relax and not worry. There's a 2x4 coming, and I have no idea what direction it's going to come from.
Right. Well, I think about it in this way that, church should be a place of wonder, but not wondering what's going to happen to you when you're there.
That's right.
We'll just touch really quickly on this last step, Liz, so that way we can give you time to do the last sort of portion about why this matters. But let's touch on step 5, scandal and hospitality, a little bit, and how both of these, queer and Christian movement both are rooted in their relationship to scandal.
Yeah, scandal is okay. So scandal is common to queerness and to the Christian path, the Christian movements. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in depth. But what I want to sort of frame what I mean by scandal, and this is a little hard to kind of grasp. It's hard for me to grasp. I'm always kind of trying to practice, like, what do I mean by this? Because it's like there's good scandal and bad scandal, or at least, I mean, there's like real scandal where somebody's done something really wrong. You know, you got a bank that's been systematically ripping off senior citizens or something, you know, like something that's wrong. And when that bank is engulfed in scandal, it's like, yeah, that's right. You know, you know, they should have been caught up in that. But then there's this other kind of scandal where somebody steps intentionally into the place of scandal. And this is the scandal that's like, oh, that's horrible. It shouldn't be like that. You're not supposed to be like that. That's like false scandal, where we're using the notion that something is scandalous in order to keep people from being their true selves, right? And that's really the scandal of the cross, right there. You know, the scandal of the cross is that the crucifixion was this shameful way of dying. And what does Jesus do? He's like, put me on it. Let's see how powerful this is, you know? And yeah, it kills him. But that this is the centerpiece of our faith, is the idea that 3 days later he's resurrected. Because ultimately, powerful as that is, awful as it is, gruesome as it is, that scandal and the violence of it is not stronger than God. Yeah. So the scandal that we're supposed to exhibit as Christians is the willingness to take on this kind of false scandal. You're going to be so afraid of being ashamed that you're not going to step out of line here. No.
Right.
We take that on. If that's what you think, count me in. I'll be scandalous. I'll be the first one in line. You take on that kind of scandal in order to reveal the power of God, the true power, the power of your identity, the power of what it is to know who you are and stand in that truth.
Right. And I think, you know,
go ahead.
I just want to say, I think that this is a great question to have in community, right? Is, you know, a step you could take is asking, you know, what is the biggest risk our community has taken in pursuit of our Christian call, right? Why did you risk it? What truth were you telling? You know, what shame or violence did you face? And, you know, was there any way that you were exposing yourself to scandal in order to reveal what true scandal is, right? And these are important conversations to have. What are we, and all threads together, you know, what are we risking, and do we know why? And are we authentic about why that is? So Liz, I want to,
I was going to add real quick, that very often Christian hospitality, you know, a lot of our outreach ministries often have some kind of aspect of hospitality, and hospitality is where the rubber should hit the road. Right. On questions of scandal. So just as Pam is saying, as you're thinking about what a next step in scandal would be, one place to look is, what is your community doing out in the world? And again, not just in terms of LGBTQ people, what's your community doing? And is there scandal in it? And if there's not, and again, I don't just mean social embarrassment or something like that. I don't just mean, ooh, it's, you know, we've got these people coming in to get showers and they smell bad and it's unpleasant. No, the scandal is about more than that. So to sort of think about, where's the scandal in our witness right now? And to be looking at hospitality as well as a lens for thinking about, how does scandal come into play there? That's a really great next step conversation we're having.
And those two words that we would hardly ever put together, that's scandal and hospitality, right? How are we so hospitable? How are we so, you know, authentic and loving and standing up for truth, that it is a scandal, right? So Liz, I want to invite you into, you know, kind of sharing with us for the next few minutes, why does this matter, right? Why does sort of taking this on that maybe creates a different foundation for things that we've become familiar with, identifying with as people of faith? Why does it matter that we are open to embracing this, embracing scandal, embracing all these things that may sound exciting, but you know, it can be really daunting. So why does it matter?
At this point, I'm gonna finish up my talk, and this is the shorter end of the talk, just, you know, and I'm gonna go through a little quickly because I really want to hear from you all about kind of what you're making of this, okay? Here we go. As I have pondered the relationship between queerness and Christianity, this is one of the most significant things I have learned. The importance and the effectiveness of both of these paths, queer and Christian, are rooted in their relationship to scandal. I want to talk about this for a moment because Christians hardly ever talk about our relationship to scandal, except when some church leader has been engulfed in it. And queers began inching away from scandal years ago when we trained our communal energy on marriage equality and other signs of societal acceptance. But the simple truth is that both queerness and Christianity are deeply scandalous. And this scandalousness is a vital part of both movements' power. It's relatively easy to see the scandal in queer experience, our identities and relationships, our overt carnality and open embrace of sexuality. These are all scandalous, an affront to many people still, especially people who consider themselves to be respectable members of society. Of course, a great many people who consider themselves to be respectable members of society identify as Christian. But Christianity was never meant to be a respectable religion. Jesus entered into scandal every chance he could, starting 9 months before that moment in the barn we discussed a few minutes ago. Conceived out of wedlock, his entire life on earth was a deep dive into experiences that offended the arbiters of social and religious propriety of his day. It was a scandal whenever Jesus touched someone who was considered ritually unclean, which was a key part of his healing ministries. He scandalized people every time he defended adulterers, or allowed women to touch him, or called people on the margins of society by name and told them how much God valued them. The epicenter of Christian scandal, as I was just saying a second ago, is the cross. Crucifixion was deployed by Rome to keep people in line. It was a public spectacle designed to cast a bright spotlight of shame on its victims. Christian faith centers on the claim that Jesus was crucified, that he really died on that cross, and that he was resurrected, that he really came back from the dead. The whole point of this narrative is to shake up conventional notions about life and death, but also specifically to disrupt conventional notions about how power works. Jesus was mocked and strung up to die in a hideous manner. When he is resurrected, he doesn't just beat death. He also beats every violent, coercive strategy that is designed to strip human beings of our dignity. These power dynamics are the reason that this conversation matters so much right now. A healthy dose of disruptive, binary rupturing proclamation would be good, not just for the queers and not just for the church, but for the world in which we live. I don't know how any of you identify politically or theologically, but I want to speak for a moment directly to those of you who identify as Christian and lean a little to the left. Those of us on the Christian left are absolutely right to stand up to anti-immigrant fervor, to protest virulent racism, white supremacy, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Jesus was crystal clear about basic issues like respecting the dignity of folks on the margins. But when those of us on the Christian left, are called to explain the scriptural basis for our actions, especially when it comes to justice for two-spirit LGBTQ people, we have tended to stammer vague platitudes about loving your neighbor. Without explanation or context, the second great commandment sounds like a request to be polite. My friends, it is not enough to put verses of scripture into play like tennis balls. Right-wing Christian serves a smashing clobber passage. Left-wing Christians returns volley with nice Jesus quote. It's not enough. Prophetic witness demands more of us. The human race desperately needs to make meaning in this complex and globalized world. In the midst of division and fear and a global pandemic, we need to know how to move forward with health. If the Christian left is to offer anything of value, we must do two things first. We must cultivate a theological framework to guide our vision. We need lenses that help us make sense both of the theological tradition that we've inherited and the world in which we now live. Second, we must model that theology. That's what these next steps are all about. The most important way that we can do that is to own the scandal we are, and with immense joy, be the scandalous people that God has created us to be. For me, queerness has become both a theological lens and a modus operandi. It is simple without being simplistic, and I find the clarity it provides to be consistently refreshing, whether I'm thinking about theology or politics, or trying to navigate interpersonal dynamics, including the dynamics of what goes on inside a church. Queer experience offers daily lessons in how to do the most essential work of Christian ethics. Queer people know what it is to discern an identity and find a healthy kind of pride in it. Queer people know how to come out, witnessing to our identities and to our dignity. Coming out could be an extraordinary model for Christian evangelism, telling the good news not by threatening people with damnation, but by witnessing to something that is actually good. Christians could learn a lot from queer people about how to foster power dynamics that allow all of us to be our full, authentic selves, facilitating healthier relationships and breeding stronger, more vibrant communities. Finally, queer experience can help Christians comprehend what it means to enter into scandal willingly and joyfully, and why it matters so much to do so. Many Christians take seriously our call to stand with people on the margins of society. What we often fail to appreciate is that this kind of outreach is shot through with scandal. Christian hospitality isn't about being nice to people. It's about helping people perceive their God-given dignity by upending systems that do violence to people's bodies and souls. This kind of disruption scandalizes, and if it doesn't, it isn't doing an important part of its job. This kind of disruption is queerness incarnate. It is at the heart of what Jesus was trying to get his followers to comprehend, to be, to do. Many queer people understand these dynamics viscerally. Christians could regain enormous credibility simply by opening our eyes to see the virtue that queer people model every day. But Christians could gain so much more if we would truly value the gift that queerness is, celebrate it, and determine to learn from it. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Challenging. I think it's whatever our identity is as queer folks and allies, and that's a challenge across the board, right? Thank you. A few of the questions that we got in that we have a little bit of time for, Liz, is someone said, they said it might be off topic, but I think it's actually pretty on topic, because I think it's beyond this one, happening of the trucks in Ottawa, but it's a question of, how do we as Christians identify as such without endorsing Christian identified groups that we know are antagonistic and we know are causing harm? How do we do that?
I've been thinking about this a lot. And the more I think about it, the more I think that we need mostly to be modeling something really different and modeling it in a super visible way. I've been thinking about the path of the queer justice movement, and how for a long time, particularly within faith communities, there was this strong effort to tell our stories, And people thought, if I tell my story and how badly I've been hurt and all this kind of stuff, it'll move people's hearts and they'll realize we should be different. You know, we should be open to people, you know. And that did win over some hearts, but we've reached a point now where that's gone as far as it's going to get. The thing that when I hear that someone's had like a conversion experience on issues related to LGBTQ identity, it's usually because what they're saying is, oh my God, like I just saw this extraordinary act of love, and I've never seen anything like that. First time this happened to me, I was working as a chaplain of folks with HIV/AIDS, and there was this one social worker who was seriously homophobic. And he came into me in tears one day and he said, I'm wrong. He said, I just sat with this man as he died and his lover was there and his lover took better care of him than anybody I've seen in all the depth of their love for each other. He said, I've never seen anything like it in my life. That's, you know, that's love and ethics, but it's living into something in a super visible way. Mm-hmm. Naming what it is as we go along.
Right. And being, you know, I remember Bishop Gene Robinson said, it's one thing to practice what we preach. It's another thing to preach what we practice. Right. And so to not be ashamed, to not be shy, especially in moments like this, to say, this is part of my identity. And I know that it's being used for this, but I'm here to say, this is what it means for me. Right. And to preach what we practice and to get it out there. Someone is also saying, you know, asking how much energy does it take to engage in each step? And is it acceptable to step back and rest and recuperate and get our strength back?
I mean, yeah, of course. You know, I think most people need to take breaks like that. It also matters to say that there are people who don't ever get a chance to do that. You know, there are people who are visibly themselves, and that as soon as they walk out their door, you know, if you know, a person of color doesn't have the choice to just take a break from that and, you know, walk the street being white for a while. You know, there's in queer circles, we talk about the privilege of the closet, which is truer for some people than for others. And the only reason that I lift that up is because it really matters to just be aware of the privilege that might allow somebody, you know, any one of us at some time to say, I just need to put this down, or I need to minimize what I'm doing to sort of be in your face. And I really do believe that one of the most crucial next steps that affirming communities should be doing is upping the general level of risk that community is taking on, mm-hmm. in order to bring down the risk that queer people, that folks of color, that Indigenous people, that brings down the risk by leveling the playing field a little bit.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it is, one thing that I would want to add to that is just, what are we resting from? You know, like, is it because, yes, this is a lot, and maybe our community needs a minute to sort of absorb the change that's happening, and, you know, that sort of thing, or because we feel afraid, you know, and to be honest about where that instinct to sort of push the brakes a little bit, you know, comes from.
And, you know, that's exactly right. And you're reminding me that, you know, this is why, to me, this all starts by knowing who you are, because that itself becomes this fuel inside of you, you know, and particularly the more you cultivate that sense of who you are, rooted in God, there's power in that. There's a lot of power in that. And the truth is, it does get easier just to be who you are in the world. It gets easier to do so with dignity. It gets easier to do so with compassion. It gets easier to take on the slings and the arrows and not just like, oh, get back in somebody's face. It gets easier to build relationships with other people who also know who they are and have that source of power and share that with one another. You know, one of the best ways one can recharge in this work is by having moments where you're, like fellowship, where you're hanging out with somebody else who really knows who they are. And you can be in that space together.
I deeply appreciate how you shared that. And I think it is compassionate for us to think about, you know, how can we remember that we're not alone either, and that, it's called steps, and there's, all these different things for a reason, because it's not anything that we will ever arrive at perfectly. But it is something that, we can even take these bite-sized movements, right, that add up to something that's really revolutionary. That's the way that I came out. I don't know how you can call 25 years a big chunk at once. I had to take as I could, a little bit at a time, and then how those things have helped me navigate all of these other things that have happened. We had some really great comments too that I just want to name, and then we'll end with one last question, Liz. So somebody says, very profound. Can we risk more so queer people don't have to risk as much? And someone added, can I, as a queer white person, risk more so that Black people or Indigenous people risk less?
Thank you. Yep.
And so I think that touches on, these are questions for everybody, right? And to know that I'm not embodying all of these virtues at once just for fact of being queer. I am gifted with the invitation I've had from being, to me, able to be queer, and others that have, had that invitation in different ways. But it's something that we are all on the same journey. This is a great question to end our time with, and so we have, regarding identity and pride, what does it look like to take ownership for the best and responsibility for the worst of Christianity, as someone who might be an ambivalent Christian or agnostic, or as someone who moves in many secular spaces and isn't often called to come out as Christian, but finds a lot of solace in faith and faith communities?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. That's a tough. It can be tough. And I'm going to come back again to this business about identity, which is all sort of rooted in who you are. And on this score, I don't have a simple answer for you, except to say that accountability here has to do with standing where you are, wherever that you're comfortable there, and being honest about what has been harmful in this tradition. I'm reading this amazing book that actually has not yet come out. It's on religious trauma, and I'm doing a blurb for it. But I'm absolutely captivated by it. And this woman tells these stories about queer people who have grown up predominantly in like right-wing faith traditions, and then they find their way into a more progressive community, which very often is healing, not always, but very often is. And she's talking right now about the importance of taking responsibility for the history that they've inherited, and the ways that their own church is not necessarily still living up to who they want to be. The point of that is that it's super easy right now to point fingers at other people and talk about how they aren't getting it right. And one of the most important things we can do right now is to be accountable for ourselves and speak hard truths about how we're not yet there. We're not yet getting it right. And anybody who's got any connection to Christianity at all, we got a lot of brutality in our history, a lot, going back millennia, centuries and millennia. And it simply matters to be honest about that and try to chart a different path with a lot of humility.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, for Liz, for your answers and your perspective and your life that has, brought you to this place and held so many sacred stories of others, to be able to invite us into how can we reignite these pieces of our identity, and refine them and make them in a way that revitalize our communities and heals our communities, which is so in need right now. I want to draw folks' attention to the chat really quick because I posted in there a link to the Queer Virtue Study Guide, and we talked a lot about having these sorts of discussions in your communities, whether that means your family, your roommates, your megachurch, your small group, your Bible study group. These are really good questions to have in community, to go through these steps and to be able to have these conversations in a way that Liz has very invitationally set out. It's really accessible, really easy to go through. And you can do it, it's set up that you could do it for 5 weeks in Lent, for example, but you can really do it anytime. And you are welcome to do that. And obviously buy Liz's book as well. We have another event on March 4th called Everyone Gets a Slice, and it's an affirming panel on maybe some of the letters or identities that we don't give a lot of attention to, and chatting about that. And then I also pasted the Glitter and Ash Wednesday video so you can learn more about that. And if you want to get involved in that this Ash Wednesday. This will also be recorded. We will be posting it on our Facebook page and have it living on our YouTube channel. So please avail yourself of that. Send it to folks. Somebody said, message me and said in here, this is a conversation that needs to happen right at this moment. And I couldn't agree more. So I really, really am encouraged by all of the folks who are here. And it makes me feel challenged and inspired to keep going on my own path as well. So Liz, it is such a pleasure to get to be in community with you. And I know you have lots of, of fans here, and I'm sure even more after this evening. And folks, thank you. This matters. This really matters. And the fact that you have taken your time on a Friday night to be curious about this says something about who you are and what your identity is and your ability to create change in your own unique ways.